First of all, thanks to JF Books who hosted the event tonight, and thank you everyone for coming. I grew up in Shanghai, so I have been to Jifeng many times at the subway station of Shanxi Nanlu, and that was back in the early 2000s. I was probably a little bit too shy back then to attend any literary events, but I always secretly wished to. Because I thought Jifeng was really the best of what a bookstore could be, to always encourage these kind of conversations and dialogues. So it is a dream come true today for me here. And I'm so glad that after all the headwinds over the years, Jifeng was able to breathe into its new life here in DC and continued its legacy. I lived in this city for a couple of years myself, so being here is meaningful to me on so many different levels. Now, before we talk about the book, I would like to first give you a brief introduction about myself and my background as a writer. So I was born in Shanghai in the 1980s, a millennial and an only child out of so many of this one-child generation. Both of my grandparents had KMT affiliations, KMT as in Kuomintang, the opposing party of the communists before the Civil War, during the Civil War before 1949. So one of them was a junior official and the other was a doctor. So you can imagine what was in store for them in the 1950s and 60s by turning down the flight tickets to Taiwan and choosing to stay on the mainland. So one of them was imprisoned and nearly died during the Great Famine while still in prison, and the other powered through the Cultural Revolution by cleaning toilets. So in my novel, I actually combined both of my grandparents' experiences into one character. And that's something you can do with fiction. So we can talk more about that in a little bit. Now, the story of my grandparents and my parents, I found them out much later in life when I was already an adult. Because you see, our parents harbored shame and they didn't want to burden their younger children with history. But the history, the trauma of history is of course generational. My father was labeled as the 5 black categories, 黑五类, which includes landlords, rich peasants, counter-revolutionaries, rightists, and bad elements. And he couldn't go to university until the end of the Cultural Revolution, which ended in 1976, when he was already 30 years old. So in the 1980s, when I was growing up, my parents were very busy making up for the time they had lost during the Cultural Revolution. My father was trying to make professor, and my mother was also studying for her university degree after work. And by being an only child, I think that kind of loneliness caused by both of our nation's devastating history in the 20th century and also by the recent policy at the time. You know, the one-child policy started in 1979 and lasted all the way till 2015. So that loneliness was ever there throughout my childhood. And that was what got me into reading and writing in the first place. In fact, I think I was trying to seek for a deeper connection in time and space, even before I got to know my own family. Now, the background of my family story is not unique for a Chinese person my generation. Many families have a similar story. Perhaps some of you in the audience today have a different version of the same story. I am one out of a million, and I am one of thousands who chose to uproot and migrate. What was perhaps a little bit unusual is that I took a detour in Hong Kong for about 12 years. So I have migrated twice so far in my life. I started writing my book, South of the Yangtze, in 2018 when I was in Hong Kong. I had just gotten married a year earlier, and my husband was from the US. So I thought it might be nice to take him on a trip with my parents to a place that I have been to so many times throughout my childhood, my grandparents' ancestral village in Zhejiang province. Now, this is a village that is in a small town called Zhuji. So for people who grew up in Shanghai or the wider Yangtze Delta area, you probably have heard of it. It is part of the Shaoxing County and the birthplace for Wuyue culture, which dated all the way back to the late spring and autumn period in around 500 BC. In the current day, it is a small town that is most famous for producing freshwater pearls and socks. So the ancestral village we went to was even more provincial. For example, when my family was walking on the main commercial street, there were strangers who would just stop us and recognize my father, who merely spent part of his brief childhood there. And when my uncle hosted lunch at his place, there were stranger country gentlemen, xiangshen, who would just show up at the dining table and eat with us. So apparently, when there was a feast in the village, everyone was welcome to join in. And my husband counted meat from 12 different animals in one meal. And of course, there was another stranger who challenged him with a drinking game with the local Shaoxing wine. So that trip was memorable for him to have a taste of my local culture, no pun intended. And during that trip, we also visited some other place in Jiangnan, which including the beautiful city like Hangzhou. Jiangnan literally means south of the river, south of the Yangtze River, which in the Chinese context, it is often referred to as the land of fish and rice. So that trip sort of sent me down a path of nostalgia in a month after, of my origin, of my roots, of the trajectory of my migration, and even of my mother tongue, Shanghainese. So that was in 2018 and 2019, and I was reflecting on all this and coming to terms with what it means to lose your cultural homeland when the height of the Hong Kong protests was happening in front of my eyes. So in many ways, I think Hong Kong has the best of both worlds for a Chinese immigrant. And it is the ideal halfway place for people who are not fully resolute to leave their cultural homeland. So, for example, there are lots of Shanghainese immigrants in Hong Kong from an older generation. And therefore, there are numerous authentic Shanghainese restaurants in Hong Kong to witness those waves of migration. And I could always find the home-style zhongzi during the Dragon Boat Festival, Duanwujie, in Hong Kong, and the meat mooncakes, which is very specific to the Shanghai region during the Mid-Autumn Festival. So I had always felt that connection in Hong Kong. On the other hand, people who grew up on the mainland during the 1980s, 1990s, or even the early 2000s have been very much influenced by Cantopop and Hong Kong cinema. I think a lot of us could sing Cantonese songs even before we learned to speak the language. But at the heart of all that fondness for Hong Kong was the imagination of what China could have been were it to adopt a different system and way of life. I think the loss for Hong Kong, especially over the past decade, was a loss for many people on the mainland as well, although those voices lamenting for Hong Kong was largely censored and unheard. During 2019 and later during the pandemic, I think if you go onto the internet, for example, the Chinese-speaking sphere, you will hear a lot of unsavory voices and, polarizing views. I suspect some of them was actually orchestrated by the Chinese government itself to create that divide. Because you see, in any culture, including America today, the autocrat would always try to encourage social, emotional, and linguistic isolation so that they can overtake as the only anchoring voice and truth for people to turn to. In some ways, I think the autocrat likes to encourage their oppressed people to have a fear for the outside and a fear for the other, and even a fear to be discriminated when they reach out for connections. But in reality, the oppressed does not carry the sin of the oppressor. And Chinese people are certainly not the Chinese government. And their lives are so much more nuanced. And each of our nuanced experiences seeks to resonate with someone and wants to be seen and heard and deserves a deeper connection instead of generalization. So when I was writing the novel, I felt that telling a personal story, even though I'm just one ordinary person, was my small way of trying to build those bridges, among all these upheavals happening around us, to actually protest against the authoritarian who wants to ban and silence voices, and to encourage self-censorship, and to deny our gateways to other people's minds and hearts, and essentially, to alienate ourselves from our very own feelings. That was the original incarnation of my book, and later the driver for me to finish it. Now let's move on to talk a little bit more about my book itself. So the story started with the protagonist, Yinan, which I created this name based on the Tang Dynasty poet Bai Juyi's famous poem Yijiangnan, which means missing the south. So Yinan was taking a trip with her American husband via the high-speed bullet train in south of the Yangtze Delta area. They just got married and she was in her mid-30s. So that trip reminded her of the first time when she took the same journey with her parents in the 1990s. And back then the train was very slow, rudimentary, and way too crowded. I believe we called it 绿皮火车 at the time. But she also remembered the stories and folk tales her parents told her about the region and about the Wuyue culture. And she remembered her fondness for all the Chinese classics, literature, poetry, calligraphy, tea, and silk, which all flourished in Jiangnan. And she could feel the beauty of the landscape, but at the same time feeling the sadness of departing from it, and also finding that deeper understanding and an anchor within her husband, who struggles to speak the language or even just getting the four tones right. So Ina realized that what he had known her for was essentially her second life, the life when she lived abroad and the life she lived mostly in English. So our protagonist decided to tell him her family story and her upbringing. All the way started from growing up in a Longtang house in Shanghai with her grandparents and a life she lived in Chinese. Now, up to this point, the novel feels very autobiographical, and it is from the beginning, but it did evolve and crystallize, basically because my own life is not as interesting as that of my characters, and not as introspective, certainly not at that age. But I did take a lot of my own experiences from my early life and weaved it into the story. So when Ina was in school, she wore a young pioneer's red scarf and she received a nationalist education. She sang the national anthem every day, sort of as a daily affirmation, but she also wondered about the lyrics. So why people who do not want to be slaves must use their blood and sweat to build a new Great Wall. So that is the opening line of the Chinese national anthem. Arise, those who do not want to be slaves, let us use the blood and sweat to build a new Great Wall. So Ina was very unsure about that daily affirmation. And she also thought that the four characters idioms, 成语, which means ready language, was overly used in the evening news and now in her classmates' writing. And after a conversation with her father, expressing the frustration that language limits the boundary of thoughts, her father decided to start teaching her some Chinese at home. Little did she know that this new linguistic tool will pull her out of some of her darkest times in her life. When Ina was in middle school, she met a best friend whose name is Jie. And despite their shared love for books and culture, Jie decided to join the Communist Party. Now, Jie is a character that I had created based on some people I know from my early life, who does not actually have the political zest, but only made these decisions because of pragmatic reasons, to get them into universities, for example. So Jie was from an economically disadvantaged family, and she was not romantically inclined. So when she worried that her academic scores were not competitive enough, she sought out the only other way in the system that she believed to help her, to help give her a leg up in school and beyond. And Jie is the character that stayed in much of Ina's adolescent life. And you can see the different decisions they made along the way. And another relationship Ina got herself into was a sexual relationship with her high school teacher. And that was much more traumatic and transformational for her. So that all started at the turn of the century, in the summer of 1999. Many of you probably would remember that since that year is the 10th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Chinese government was very nervous. And back then, there was this event happened in the former Yugoslavia that worked in favor of their propaganda. The Chinese embassy in Belgrade was bombed by a NATO plane, and 3 Chinese journalists died because of that. And that was a really tragic event. I think at the time, the NATO said that it was an accident. The pilot bombed the wrong target because of an outdated map. The Chinese government, of course, believed otherwise. But no matter what their true belief was, they launched this full-on anti-West rhetoric right away that summer. So the nationalist sentiment in Yinan's high school was soaring high. But on June the 4th, that day, there was this teacher who was originally from Beijing as part of the school's efforts to hire more Mandarin-speaking teachers to popularize the language in replacement of local dialects such as Shanghainese. So those were the waves of language assimilation happening in the 1990s. And on June the 4th that day, this teacher came to the classroom dressed head to toe in white, a traditional mourning color for the Chinese. And he was obviously too distressed to teach, to an extent that he left the classroom soon after. And our protagonist, Yinan, was deeply intrigued by that reaction. And she was full of questions. And later she learned that this teacher was once an activist during the Tiananmen Square protests 10 years ago. So one thing led to another. They started this illicit, intimate relationship. And Yinan was only 16 years old at the time. So you can see that there are 2 elements at work here in the story. On one hand, Yinan was getting a first-hand access to history and to a time that her whole educational system wanted to erase. And on the other hand, there was this adult who clearly took sexual advantage of her. So Yinan was lost and she was in an emotional turmoil. And she must break through from that relationship, both physically and psychologically. So without giving too much of the book away, I want to say that over time, she did both. And one of the things that helped her was trying to read and think as much as she could in English. Now, the Chinese language, in many ways, is still very pictographic. I'm not a linguist, but I think every Chinese speaker knows that many of our characters mimic its shape, the shape of its meaning in nature. So, for example, the character mountain looks like mountain, and the character water looks like water. I actually borrowed this Chinese learning picture book from my 3-year-old here to show you. So you can see, this is the character for mountain, Shan, which looks like mountain with 3 peaks. And here is the character for river, Chuan, which looks like, the motion of waves. So seeing mountain is mountain and water is water. 见山是山，见水是水, literally, right? But this pictographic trait of the Chinese language allows its users to have a shared imagination and therefore creating a close-knit community. But there are limitations to that imagination. So for example, if your character mountain looks like that, does it limit you from imagining it with other shapes, right? And another example, if your character man is composed of radicals, field, and strength, which means somebody who is strong enough to work in a field, and your character married woman is composed of radicals, woman, and a broom, which means somebody is carrying around a broom all day. So how does this impact the shared expectation of gender roles? And if you're very familiar with idioms, 成语, such as 红颜祸水, rosy complexion, disastrous water, which means women is often seen as scapegoat for the downfall of kingdoms. And there's so many stories in history to back that claim. So how does that help or unhelp a young woman to navigate the shame and self-blame when they find themselves in Yinan's situation? So our protagonist used English sort of as a map, and she chose the words carefully to explain her situation. I think English is by no means a perfect language, but for our protagonist, any language that is not her native language can serve that role of breaking that boundary. So it's a little bit of that real insight and perhaps some escapism as well. Yinan moved on. She grew up and she was able to function in a normal fashion in society. Now, in the second part of the story, I was trying to ask another question as we now follow Yinan's life as a young adult. So what are the costs for adopting a new language and a new way of life? Of course, you can say that, well, you can have both. But in reality, we always lose something when we gain something else, no matter we realize it at the time or not. And I think as an immigrant, on good days, sometimes you feel like you belong to many places, and on bad days, you feel like you belong to none. And we each have to find that difficult balance and make our own peace during this migration process, which is often a multi-generational effort. So in the later part of the story, Yinan met a Chinese American friend whose name is Simon. And Simon decided to learn more Chinese so that he can feel more grounded, and more importantly, to have a better relationship with his estranged father. So, like many Chinese Americans, Simon was uprooted from a culture he knew little about to begin with, through his parents' decisions to immigrate. Now we have two people here in the story. One tried to forsake a language, and the other tried to regain the very language. So as they got to know each other better, and their lives got entwined, what will each of their psychological journeys look like? I think in this part of the story, I probably asked more questions than answering them. And of course, I think the experience of a Chinese immigrant in the US and elsewhere are highly uneven. You know, some families speak more Chinese at home and some do not, for example. And their challenges cannot be generalized and should not be. What I wanted to offer here is really just a glimpse of what is in store in the future for Yinan after her coming of age. I think every of our decisions comes with regrets. So what are some of her regrets, and how does she cope with them? And I like this about fiction too, that you can really put characters in situations that test their decisions, their morality, and their soul. I think I want to now end this presentation, before I take questions, to just read from a short chapter in my book. So this section, located in the middle of the story, Chapter 14, it is entitled Love, I. In Mandarin, the word love sounds like a sigh, I, in a forced tone, short and assured. The written character of love, I, consists of 4 parts: pause, roof, heart, and crossed legs or arrival. The simplified version used since the 1950s and 60s in mainland China is I, without the heart radical. The simplification might be the reason why, more than once in my life, the announcement of love always felt like the opposite. It felt like finality, a swan song. When I was a child, and when beginning to learn the written language, I used to fill 3 sheets of new characters each week for homework. And now in my 30s, it had been a long time since I had routinely practiced calligraphy. Back on Dolan Road, my grandfather used to sit in front of the desk, lay out his rice paper, and lose himself for hours in writing. He wrote in traditional characters, and he had a beautiful ink stick and stone set made in Lanting, Zhejiang province, the place most famous for its gathering of calligraphers. My grandmother was often the one who helped to grind the ink. The amount of ink on the brush, the thickness of the strokes, the flow of the running lines, and the knit between characters I was taught, had all played a crucial part in written expression. My grandfather knew how to write a poem in both Yan Zhenqing and Liu Gongquan ways, significantly different styles referred to as the muscle of Yan and the bone of Liu. But why, like my grandfather, was I also naturally drawn to calligraphy? Was it because the inherited words in printed form were not enough? Form devoid of vital emotion. During those early years, I didn't consider the time spent as worthwhile. Not writing down any new ideas, but running the brush over and over again to take each character apart and examine our tools from the beginning of time. In my final year of high school, I seemed to have lost both interest and ability to read in Chinese. Memorizing textbooks was one thing, but whenever I opened up a leisure book, the once beloved square-shaped characters started to dance around without forming any meaning. I only saw bits and parts, dots and strokes, stems, branches, and radicals. My father used to say that to his German colleagues. Chinese characters look like tens of thousands of variations of houses or innovative drawings of spiders. And we had a good laugh about it. Now I wondered if what I had been seeing all along had also been lines of houses, molding and containing my every thought within their 4 walls. Or were they armies of spiders, weaving the same symmetrical web with alluring silk, waiting quietly for the human prey of every generation? Did I mistake these webs for my own heartstrings? But without any instrument, how do I hear my own heart? Thank you.
Hi, Flora.
Hi.
I was going to ask you, I know that writing a book can have lots of challenges and also moments of joy. So I was wondering if you would talk about what was maybe the biggest challenge for you in writing the story, and if there was a moment that you would talk about as something that you found joy in the moment of writing?
Mhm. I think when I was writing it, I was really immersed in the writing process. I think the joy comes with it. Every conversation I had with friends at the time, every book I read, and even the natural scenes I saw, they all got into my project. So I was really immersed in it. And I was somebody who liked to sort of push through the first draft as quickly as possible, and then coming back to it and keep revising it. I think that revision process, sort of, finding those voices through the dark tunnels, was one of the most joyful moments of writing it. I think the challenges with it is there are so many emotional moments when I was writing this story. The political events and the personal lives of my characters are interwoven. And I think when I was writing it, one of the events that provided a lot of exigence for the novel was the Hong Kong protests. So I always felt that, ever since Hong Kong was decided to return back to China, there was already a lot of sadness, there was a lot of searching voices, but there was also this quiet unity that bonded the society together. But in 2019, as I was writing my book, I felt that, the polarizing views and the color of people's politics was making everybody so lonely and unhappy. And I think that's why I felt that storytelling is powerful. And I particularly like the longer novel form because it not only allows us to get a glimpse of people's lives like what we're used to on the internet these days, but to see the whole trajectory of how people get to where they are. And I think we will often find that, humanity shares a lot in common than our differences. I think, as a novelist, I really cannot and I do not really want to promote political views. I think there are people better for it, but I think what I really care about is, to detail the nuances in humanity and explore those common fears and desires we all have, the desire to be loved, the desire to be heard and not to feel lonely. I think, navigating these challenges also brought me joy eventually while I was writing it.
Thank you, Flora, for your sharing. And I have a feeling that the Chinese language is a big theme in your novel. And to me, I think it's a very interesting experience to hear someone use such a delicate English to describe the delicate other language, Chinese. But I'm afraid maybe for your readers, it is just those ones who can really understand Chinese can really understand the delicate emotion in your novel. So here comes my question, because I think for everyone like you and me who has a real understanding of the Chinese language, we will always understand this is not just a language. There's a whole set of culture, history, and maybe sadly nowadays some kind of the storytelling behind this language. So I would like to hear your thoughts. What's your feeling of our mother language? Whether it brings you more love, encouragement, or sadness, frustration?
I think, every language inspires as they frustrate, right? It's the case for Chinese as well. I think I chose to write my novel in English first and foremost because of censorship issues, and because the political events I mentioned, the Tiananmen Square massacre is a big part of the story, and I also mentioned the SARS epidemic in 2003 and the beginning of Hong Kong protests. So those are events not to be freely discussed in a Chinese language. And I didn't want that kind of limitation and self-censorship when I was writing the book. But as you said, there is a great sadness that comes with it, by deciding to write in English, because I feel that people who can resonate with it the most may not be able to read it. And that is the challenge of many writers who chose to leave their authoritarian government and country to write in a different language. I'm trying to look more at the plus side these days. My book was published in Hong Kong, so even though the freedom of speech is quickly diminishing there, but there is still some room to talk about history in Hong Kong. And I think the reading public there is largely bilingual. So I'm imagining my readers is not only readers whose native language is English, but anyone who can read in English, including the Chinese audience. I think it is a difficult balance. I'm trying to, explain some of the Chinese words I mentioned, to provide a little bit of historical context and to, just flesh out the story a little bit. But, over-explanation, of course, can disrupt the flow. So it is a very difficult balance. I'm hoping that people who read some of the Chinese references and be interested in a story can try to find more and do more research about the topic. That's my hope.
On this question of language, I think something that I personally have thought a lot about is, I think, like, as you said, right, as multilingual writers, I think there is this ability to sort of, I think, transform and translate in a lot of different ways some of the underlying sort of cultural elements to this. I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on, in your writing process, right, and kind of with a more forward-looking sort of perspective. I think, like you mentioned, that this is kind of written implicitly with the sort of bilingual audience kind of in mind. Curious to hear your thoughts on basically whether this sort of inherently bilingual experience, cultural experience that you're describing here is something that is able to be communicated to maybe someone that's in the diaspora community, right? Like, is that even, I guess, something that bilingual writers should strive for? Like, what is kind of the role in I think, like, preserving and passing on that sort of experience? If that's something that you, I guess, consciously factored into your writing, and I hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I think the bilingual experience is very personal. But for me, I think a lot of people are doing precisely this without thinking too much about it. And I really want to sort of detail the experience so that it might inform some people who are seeking for these options to sort of break the boundary of thoughts. Because English and Chinese are so different, right? I think in my book, I mentioned a little bit about when Yinan was trying to think more English. For example, she was very cautious about whether to use past or present tense to decide whether something you should leave in the past and not to bring the trauma into the present. And also, English has the passive voices, right? So you can sort of see whether your heart is leading or being led to. So that's a distinction, which I think as a native Chinese speaker, you may not be fully aware of it. And English, because of these grammatical traits, so you started as a learner, think more about it. But I think for any second language, when you pick up the language, you sort of, it's more conscious to start with, because you can sort of choose the words you really want, But for our native language, sometimes when you pick it up and you just don't realize it's something that's already built in your system. So I sort of want to detail that experience.
You have lived in multiple cities like Shanghai, Hong Kong, and New York. How have these different cultural environments influenced your voice as a writer and the themes you choose to explore?
So I think, living in a lot of places definitely allows you to look back in at your original culture with both the perspective of an insider and as an outsider. I think when I first moved to Hong Kong, I was, of course, very excited about the environment of media, because when I grew up in Shanghai, the news we heard is boring, right? And there's only this single anchoring voice. And in Hong Kong, I was really devouring the different medias. And I think in the US, I sort of always feel that people are a lot less apologetic of their personal desires and personal needs, because in the more collective culture, I think in China, but sometimes including Hong Kong, people sort of always suppress their individualism in service of this collective good. And I feel here, part of it, I think it was influenced by the language, because in Chinese, we often talk about somebody has ambition. We use the word having 野心, right? A wild heart, which is very derogatory. Or we can say somebody have 雄心, which means like a male's heart. I think that is very gender specific as well. So I think language definitely influenced thoughts, and I feel I don't feel that kind of criticism and limitations when I live in the US, and I feel people, are more straightforward in describing, their personal ambitions. So I think that is kind of freeing for me in the US.
You mentioned like thinking English several times throughout your speech, especially the main characters. I think it's called Yinan. How do you think this language learning for the character contribute to like this character development throughout the books? It could be Yilan, it could be other characters.
I think we mostly follows Yinan's footsteps as she thinks about the language. But of course, the character Simon, who is also a big part of the second part of this story, I think, I'm trying to, really coming to terms with the loss of a language during the migration process, because for myself, my Chinese is definitely deteriorating these days with lack of practice. And that's why I want to put these two characters to interact with each other. And, to see that, I mentioned that the Chinese language was having this shared imagination that allows people to have a close-knit community. So, if Simon's estranged relationship with his father is because, they have lost this kind of connection, so will learning the Chinese language help with that? And if this is a second language, does it eliminate the concerns Yinan has, for example, that the language is highly influenced by the current government, right? So how do you actually choose the words in Chinese? I think that's the experience that Yinan was working with Simon, the character in the story.
Well, thank you so much, Flora, for this beautiful, beautiful talk, and I believe we are all very excited to read your book. So yeah, let's give a round of applause to Flora.
Thank you so much.